Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Linda Schenk and I'm the Executive Officer for Wine Communicators of Australia. Thank you for joining us today. We have a panel of speakers here today with us. We have Kirstin Hannan, the Senior Marketing Analyst for Wine Australia. Kirstin will be providing us with the key learnings from the recent wine opinions research conducted for the Australian wine sector. We have Dr. Armando Corsi, Associate Professor and Senior Marketing Specialist of Ehrenberg-Bass Institute and future leader of 2019. Welcome. Armando will be presenting the key findings from the Driving the Strategic Growth of Australian Wine in the US Market project. And we have Amelia Harris, Communications Manager Export Regional Wine Support Package for Wine Australia. Amelia will be providing us with the details of the Aussie Wine Month being held in US later this year. Very exciting times. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation, so please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type any of the questions that you have, and we will either take the questions throughout the presentations or at the end, depending on when they come through to us. It is now my pleasure to hand you over to Kirstin. Over to you.
Thanks, Linda. So good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be covering the results from the 4th year of research conducted by Wine Opinions on the US wine market. But before that, I just wanted to take you through some other information to give some background on the US wine consumption and Australian wine exports. So the United States is the world's biggest wine market, and according to the IWSR, grape wine sales in the US totaled 359 million 9-litre cases with a retail value of $37 billion in 2018. You can see in the graph on the left, which shows wine consumption measured in volume, that in the early part of this decade, the USA overtook Germany, Italy, and France to become the world's largest consumers of wine. The graph on the right shows the US market has consistently been the largest spenders on wine over the last decade, with the retail value more than double that of second place France for the last 2 years. As the market continues to grow and evolve, Wine Australia has invested in research to understand how Australian wine can grow its share of the market. And there's room for further growth. So adult per capita wine consumption in the United States was around 13.3 litres per head in 2018. In comparison, Australia sits at almost 28.6 litres per head and the UK at 22 litres, suggesting there is significant upside in wine consumption in the US as the market continues to mature. According to Wine Intelligence, who produced this lovely image here, there were 84 million regular wine drinkers in the US in 2018, with around 14.3 million, which equated to 17% of Australian wine drinking Australian wine. In comparison, there were around 29 million regular wine drinkers in the UK, which equated to 13 million or 44% who were drinking Australian wine. Again, this suggests that there is scope to convert more regular wine drinkers in the US to Australian wine. When you look at it by states, the top 7 consuming states accounted for half of the wine consumption in the United States in 2017. They were California, Florida, Texas, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and Massachusetts. They have been the top 7 for over a decade and all posted consumption increases of between 0.1 to 0.8% in 2017. As you can see in the graph, they were also the top 7 consuming states for Australian table wine. When reviewing the imported table wine consumption, the largest states were New York, followed by Florida. When you take a look at the graph with the orange points, they show the imported share of total table wine. And you can see that for New York and Florida, they're much lower for these states, as there is a lot of competition against US wines. The top 7 states also happen to have the highest adult per capita consumption, such as Massachusetts at 22 litres. But the market has its challenges for Australian wine. And over the last 10 years, Australian exports have declined by 41% in value and down by 31% in volume, for year ending March 2019. The majority of Australian exports to the United States are commercial value exports, that is, they're under $7.50 FOB, and this segment has endured the greatest loss in volume. Having said that though, we have also lost significant ground in the premium wine segment. This is due to a combination of factors: a sustained period of strong Aussie dollar against the greenback, contributing to reduced premium offering for Australia, a period of over-extracted wines having a negative impact on perceptions, Australian premium wine no longer seen as hip or exciting, and a lot of wineries exiting the market. The number of exporters to the US has fallen considerably over the years. To recover the loss in value, it is critical more exporters enter or re-enter the market. But even this has its challenges for producers, as many have found this quite difficult. And part of this difficulty is the distribution channels and access. You know, the US may be one country, but the three-tiered distribution system makes the US market very challenging to navigate, as each state has different rules and regulations. This chart here, this map, just identifies some of the areas with minimal barriers to entry, but there's also quite a few with significant barriers as well. Competition is also quite fierce. According to Wine Intelligence, US regular wine drinkers are more likely to drink wine from California, and Italian or other US and French wines rank similarly in country of origin consumption, while awareness of Australian wine was at 46%. And surprisingly, only 17% of regular wine drinking sample drank Australian wine. This is compared to 74% awareness of French wine, converting to 29% consumption. French and Italian wines also have the highest quality perceptions amongst US regular wine drinkers, which we can see in the top table on the right. Perceptions of Australian wines have seen a long-term significant increase in quality perceptions, but this has taken a hit this year in particular. Like the quality perceptions of Australian wines, long-term significant improvements in associations have seen a decline in the short term amongst drinkers and non-drinkers of Australian wine. The exit of a significant number of premium Australian brands from the US market has meant most consumers associate Australian wine with commercial value wines and less so with our more expensive fine wines. They see limited premium Australian wines on retail shelves and restaurants' wine lists. Currently, 88% of regular US wine drinkers see Australian wine has good value for money, but only 33% see Australian wine has expensive fine wine. These have all improved over the short term, but have also experienced the medium term, but have also experienced a decline in the last 12 months. So in terms of sales, Australian off-trade retail wine sales have moved in line with total US market, with volume down 1%, while value increased by 1%. The market share for Australia sits at 3.7%. The growth in wine sales in the US is coming at the super premium to super luxury end of the market, while sales in the big volume commercial value end of the market are in decline. More than half of the volume of wine sold in the US off-trade market is at below $8 a bottle, and in the latest year ending March 2019 results, sales in this segment declined by 7%. There was growth in all price points above $11 per bottle, with the strongest growth coming in the $15 to $25 per bottle. Australian sales in the US are concentrated at the commercial value end, with 84% below $8 per bottle. Australian sales mirrored the market trend in this price point, with sales falling by 8%. Australia is a major player, as I mentioned before, in that commercial end, making up 13% of the share of that segment and making us Australia as the #1 imported wine in this segment. In contrast, Australia holds only 1.7% share of the market, above $8 per bottle. There is exceptional growth for Australian wine between the $8 to $11 bottles, with sales up 37%. And there's also strong growth in Australian wines at $25+ per bottle, up 10%. But Australia only holds 1.2% market share at this price point. So just leading on into the reasons why we're into this research. So Wine Australia's marketing strategy in the US is to create positive sentiment around premium Australian wine to drive demand. So to inform this strategy, several pieces of research have been conducted, including a 5-year research project with Wine Opinions. This program was developed specifically to identify the opportunities for further market share expansion of Australia's regional and premium price segment wines. Findings have helped inform the activities funded by the $50 million package, such as the Far From Ordinary campaign in September this year. Wine Opinions were engaged to conduct qualitative research amongst the US trade in year 4 of its 5-year research plan. The purpose of this research was to provide US wine trade insights and discourse on Wine Australia's marketing strategy, identify perceived opportunities and challenges to the full implementation of the strategy, and to test a series of potential marketing and promotional scenarios designed to unlock opportunities for Australian wine. They did this through conducting 2 online discussion groups, one amongst New York retailers and distributors, and a second amongst retail and distributors' other key markets. In addition to that, they did 6 one-on-one interviews with US wine trade who had participated in the Australian Decanted in 2018. So you'll see on this slide here that there's a number of findings, but what I wanted to point out is that through the analysis and trade and consumer surveys and online survey sales results, the first 3 years of the program identified the pre-existing bias and low awareness of Australian wine. It also highlighted opportunities for certain varieties and blends like Cabernet Sauvignon, Riesling, GSM and other red blends. And these are at certain price points, which are about $15 and above per bottle for Australian wine. Wine Australia also had in-market meetings with US distributors in April last year, which also supported this research. So through those online discussion groups and interviews with retailers and distributors, specific promotional concepts and programs were assessed. These included a Costco promotional program, mock-ups of 4 different advertisements, and Wine Australia's promotional plan to promote a specific wine region pair in the over $15 per bottle category. Today, I'm only going to go through the wine region pairing findings and also tips that they provided on how to approach trade and consumers. So when it comes to leading with the wine region pairs, this was seen as quite positive, and respondents were enthusiastic about the idea of this, as it was felt that this would dispel the image of Australia as one single region and convince gatekeepers to think about Australia in a similar way to European countries, where individual regions are at the forefront of trade and often consumer thinking. In terms of leading with either variety or region, the trade agreed that the most effective way to reach trade, especially for the higher end wines and on-premise, was by region. This approach would also help position wine as being unique and authentic and comes with the least preconceived notions. On the other hand, trade believed that consumers are varietal-centric, followed by region. Advice given was to compare Australian wine to other regions by discussing what's in the glass for less experienced consumers and regional differences with those more experienced, as region is what makes Australian wine unique. Pairings considered to have the most potential or the least controversy or competition were Chardonnay priced between $15 to $25 from Margaret River, Adelaide Hills and Yarra Valley, and Cabernet Sauvignon from Margaret River and Coonawarra. For Shiraz from Barossa, respondents noted that it's still perceived as expensive and saturated, and some foresee it being difficult to promote as it is the most familiar and needs an image improvement. However, it was warned that if you want to It was warned that you don't want to ignore what brings you your customers in the first place. There was some concern that Pinot Noir faced competition from Burgundy and California, but Australia has an advantage over those wines due to their expense and homogenisation. This leads to the potential to position Pinot Noir for the adventurous. For sparkling wine from Tasmanian Adelaide Hills, this was considered as being untapped and showing great potential. And for red blends, it was important not to associate with the region and to take advantage of the fact that consumers are already quite familiar with red blends. So when it comes to advice on approaching the trade for Australian producers, it was recommended to have a standout story that is easy to remember on how the region differs, the history and what makes the label unique, but tell the whole story. But when it comes to history, even though the trade told us that they want the whole story, they still only want the highlights. The trade are interested in how the wine is made and the philosophy behind the way it was made, and to not focus so much on the background of the founder. It is interesting to note that they advise that tasting, seminars and lunches are the best way to tell the story, but in places like New York, the market is quite crowded. So they've suggested coming up with ways to make this really interesting for them to, and compelling for them to attend, such as incorporating competitive sets, having multiple vintages to show aging potential, and identifying and showing commonalities or differences across regions. Having a winemaker at an event is key as well, as it makes promotion for a personal touch and allows trade to ask questions. Finally, everyone loves a map, and promotional material that trade can go back and reference months later that includes prices and the retail selling proposition is very important. So according to the trade, tastings were considered to be the best way to introduce consumers to wine. During the tasting, it was important to find ways to create an emotional connection by incorporating with food or meeting someone from the winery. Aussie accents were also memorable for consumers. Within stores, in-store promotions that included handouts for customers were suggested by trade, as well as introductory specials and giveaways. The trade also suggested that being able to continuously communicate with consumers has proven to be very effective. Remind them about new releases, events, milestones, etc. Overall, this means that it's important to get in front of the customer, if not face-to-face, then through Facebook or Instagram. Look, further suggestions that they gave for consumer promotions included, like, be the first ones to discover what Australians drink, not what Australians export. I guess it's very similar to Australian, they always see Fosters, but Australians don't drink Fosters. There's always a whole range out there to be discovered. Make it about tasting, the history, the winemakers, the uniqueness of Australia, connect winemaking in Australia to the noble vines from Europe, and promoting value at the high end. So while there are key challenges, there are also opportunities, but it's going to take time to change perceptions of pre-existing bias against Australia and increase awareness in a highly competitive environment, ultimately to drive demand. But despite this, respondents did indicate that Australian wines have become harder to find and believe that our wines are well placed and competitively priced when targeting the right buyers. So I'll just wrap this up now. So that was just a really quick snapshot of some of the information that's available in that 4th year of the research. If you're interested in finding out more on this study and the rest of the Wine Opinions research, the full suite of reports from the research program are available in the research section of the Wine Australia website. You can also find other research conducted on the US market, which is the barriers in United States trade for developing premium Australian wines, and also Advance Australia Fair, determining the country of origin associations for Australian wine in emerging and established markets. You'll find a USA summary in there. Currently, we're progressing with the last year of the research program. We finished the field work and now we're doing the analysis and the reporting for this. So the final study allows for both consumer and trade research to be conducted to not only track the progress from since we started, but also to test some findings that we have picked up over the years. In particular, the intent is for price choice models, including selected regional variety pairs of Australian wines to be tested on consumers to yield further insights on the prospect of success in the market for the newly adopted Wine Australia strategy. So I'll thank you very much, and I will hand over to Armando shortly.
Thank you, Kirstin. If anyone's got any questions, can you just pop them through now while we're having a changing of the guards? There is a question here, Kirstin. Yep. It's the acronym.
Oh, IWSR?
Yes. What does that stand for?
International Wine and Spirits Record.
Beautiful. Okay. Thank you very much. If anyone else has got any questions, please send them through now. Otherwise, we will hand directly over to Armando, who will get into his presentation.
Perfect. Microphone is okay. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Linda. This is, I guess, the first time that we are also showing our faces. I apologize for that. Otherwise, I would put on a tie at least. But I think my voice will do as well. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Linda, as I said, for the introduction. Today, I would like to talk to you about a recent project that we're just finishing to carry out. This project, the title you can see there, is called Driving the Strategic Growth of Australian Wines in the US Market. This project has been generously funded by Wine Australia. And I also would like to thank my colleagues, Larry Lockshin, Jordan Louvier, Justin Cohen, and Johan Brewer for working with me on this project, because without their help, this would not be possible. The overall objective of the project is fairly simple, which is to increase the sales of Australian premium wines at $12 and above, which we heard from Kirstin just before is the one of the areas where we are very small in the US market, and certainly we can do better. So the project has 4 main steps, and I will probably skip through the first couple of them in the interest of time and focus more specifically on the last 2 steps of the project more in detail today. So in the discovery phase, we have interviewed a series of exporters and trade operators about the main factors hindering the growth of Australian wines in the US in what we call the Vennli stage of the project, and I will explain to you what that means in a second. We have interviewed through a series of questionnaires US trade operators in order to compare the performances of Australian wines and 5 key competitors, namely France, Italy, Chile, the US, and New Zealand. And then in a 3rd stage, the communication testing stage, we have tested a series of communication messages derived from the results of the Vennli stage. So again, with both consumers now and trade operators, in order to identify the communication challenges, the communication messages that could lead to the selection of more Australian wines at higher price points. And finally, we kind of wrapped it all up together by creating a decision support system that can be used from both trade operators and Australian wine exporters to understand better about their product offering and the target market that they can sell the product to. So as I said, in the interest of time, I'm going to skim through the first 2 stages of the project and focusing specifically on the last 2. So before moving on the next stage, what the first couple of stages in sort of focus more specifically on is that we started with 12 in-depth interviews with owners, CEOs, and general manager of Australian wines, importers and distributors. And we chatted about the main reasons why Australian wines are struggling in the US. And from there, we have generated a list of 25 major reasons that they believed impact our growth in that premium space in the US market. So then we took that list of 25 items and we put them in a questionnaire that we sent to a sample of 399 US trade operators. And we asked them to rate each of these barriers on a scale of 1 to 5. And we received 22 completed questionnaires, and we saw that there were 8 main reasons that seems to stand out among others in terms of barriers for growth of Australian wines in the US. I will show you them here just as an example of actually the results. And they were, as you can see, starting from the left, having a good reputation among media, having producers that know how to find the right importers, wines to be perceived as low price, having a brand representative visiting them at least a couple of times a year, having wines that are easy to sell, having producers who are committed to the US market, having enough shelf space at retail, and having consumers that know about the region of origin of the countries where the wines are from. So we then took these elements and we put them in a new innovative cloud-based software called the Vennli software. And if that name sounds familiar, it's probably because it is. In a sense, this is the famous Vennli diagrams. That's one you can see now in this slide. And it's one of these things where who would have thought that they would ever become useful after, sort of primary school. But actually, they are quite useful. And the way in which the software operates is, from the respondent's perspective, fairly easy. So the way in which it operates is that for each of the 423 trade operators who took part and fully completed the questionnaire, they are asked to rate each of these 8 factors on a scale of importance from 1 to 5. Then we ask them to sort of explain and tell us, again, on a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar or not they are with the wines coming from the 5 producing countries that I mentioned before. And finally, we also ask respondents to tell us how much, in percentage, how much they stock, will stock, and have ever stocked of the wines coming from each of the countries. What the software does is that it elaborates all the questions through an algorithm and returns for each sort of 2x2 country comparison a graph like the one that you can see here. So we have a 2x2 comparison between Australia, say, and the US, but we've also have sort of comparison between Australia and France, Australia and Italy, Australia and New Zealand, Australia and Chile, and Australia and Chile. So how can we interpret this kind of graph? If we start from the element that you see in sort of in the red area at the bottom, right next to the wording USA, this element means, so having consumers who know about the regions of origin of the country where the wines are from, it means that it's an element that the respondents, so again, trade operators in our case, a thing that is more closely connected to the US, of course, rather than Australia, but they don't seem to see that as a critical barrier for the growth of Australian wines at $12 and above. We then move here right up on the right, on sort of on the orange area. These are elements, so being wines to be easy to sell, having wines that are committed to the US market, producers committed to the US market, and having shelf space at retail. These are elements that, again, the respondents, so trade operators, seem to be connected more with the US, but they also believe to be of high importance for the growth of wines in that market. Then we see, you can see these 3 elements here in the middle, having a brand representative visiting at least 2 times a year, having producers who know how to find the right importers, and having good reputation among media. These are elements that the respondents see to be shared between both Australia and the US, and they're also interested about. While if an element is sort of, you can see this element here on the purple part of the graph, having wines that are perceived as low price, again, this means an element that is shared both between Australia and the US, but trade operators do not see that to be a critical factor for the growth of wines in that market. So again, in the interest of time, I cannot show you all the 2x2 graphs that we have created, but once we have analyzed all these 2x2 graphs, we found that the main three reasons why Australian wines seem to struggle in the US market were having wines that are easy to sell, having wines that have good reputation among media, and having producers who are committed to the US market. However, we decided to include a fourth element, which is this element of regionality. And the reason why we did that is because while this element didn't seem to pop up as a key factor hindering the growth of Australian wines in the US, from all the research that we've done among consumers, we know that regionality seems to be a key factor for driving the choice of wine at the consumer level. And so we said, well, we're going to include that anyway as one of the sort of communication testing messages that we can bring on in the next stage. So what the next stage looked like, it started with these ads. We hired a professional ad agency, and we asked them to design a series of ads that could communicate each of the factors that we just mentioned before. So you can see here, starting from the left, we have an ad about Australian wines that have a good reputation among media. Then we have another ad for wines being easy to sell. A third one about producers who are Australian producers to be committed with the US market. A fourth ad about regionality. But, and this is sort of, if you like, less related to just wine itself, but it's important for us from a methodological point of view to include an ad that has nothing to do with the previous ads, because when we design an experimental design, if we really want to make sure and see what is the actual value of a communication message, we also need to make sure that it's not just the fact that people are primed with something that leads to maybe a change in preferences, but there is actually the content of the message that is really key for the growth for the choice of, if you like, of a certain element later on. So the reason why we included the coffee ad is to have that element. And what we've done then is that we pre-tested each of these ads. This is again another 117 US trade operators have been shown each of these ads to make sure that they communicated exactly what we wanted them to communicate. And we have then recruited a sample of almost 1,800 consumers and 423 trade operators, which have been randomly assigned to one of each of these communication ads. So they've either seen the media ad, the easy to sell ad, the commitment ad, the regional ad, and the coffee ad, plus some others have not been shown anything. So it's the pure control version of the message. And after they've seen each of these ads, they've been exposed to 16, random choice of 16 of what we call a choice set. So this is an example of a methodology which we call discrete choice experiment, where we combine a series of product characteristics so that we can test what is the relative importance that people give to various product items. So for example, you can see here that some wines show a medal, the second and the third bottles show medals, while others don't. We have a combination of different label styles. We have wines coming from different regions of origin, different countries of origin. As you can see at the bottom of this slide, we have different price points. We have the presence or absence of critics ratings. And so these are all the, and we have also, sorry, at the top, we also have different grape varieties. So we manipulate all these elements, and we have asked both trade and consumers to choose the wine answering pretty much the same question. So for trade operators, we asked them to choose the wine that they believe will be most likely to be sold. And to consumers, we asked them to choose the wine that they would pick for the most frequent occasion that they would consume wine. I'm not going to go through all the methodological bits of how we come up with the results because it will take too much time, but this is sort of the overall results that we have found out. When we analyze the results at a very aggregate level, No surprise here, price seems to be the key critical factor for both consumers and trade operators to choose wine. This is followed by expert ratings and grape variety and country of origin for consumers, and country of origin at 27%, you can see there, 24% expert ratings, while all the other elements seems to be virtually insignificant for the choice. Now, this is the result relative to the overall sample, but we know that people do not all think the same, otherwise it would be a very boring world. So what we've done, actually, we have seen whether there were some segments in the population of both trade operators and consumers. And the results showed us that we have a much more variegated picture compared to the one that we showed before. If we look starting with a trade sample, we have a 37% of the market, which seems to be mostly driven by expert rating, followed by price and grape variety. Then we have a second segment of 34% of the market that is actually mostly driven, you see down there at 36%, by country of origin, followed by price and expert ratings. And then we have a third segment that is mostly driven by price at 43% importance, followed by expert ratings and country of origin. I think it's important, and I guess not because it's, I think, a result in contrast with what Kirstin was saying before, but it's probably part of the way in which we are collecting data. So in this situation, in this current moment, region of origin, when put together with other elements, does not seem to play a critical role for the choice. But that does not mean that in future it will not become important. So in a sense, at the moment, this is giving us a picture of the importance that people give to each element when put in context with others. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't push down the regionality element if we want to make our wines grow, Australian wines grow in the future in the US market. When we look at consumers, we find pretty much a similar pathway, again, with three groups. The first one mostly driven by country of origin, followed by expert ratings, grape variety, and price. A second group here that is pretty much driven by two things, price at 68% and expert ratings at 17%. And the third group that is driven by mostly country of origin, followed by price and grape variety. You might see that we have some names, that we've given some names to the segments. This is because we also compared not just the elements driving the choice, but a bunch of socio-demographic characteristics that are associated with each of these segments. But unfortunately, I don't have time to go in detail with all of these elements today. But I will show you in a few seconds where else you can find that kind of information. So I guess to conclude on this part of the results, we've shown that regions of origins and medals are not that critical, as previous research has shown. That Australian wines are not top of mind in the US, neither with trade operators or among consumers. As Kirstin again was saying before, we need to do a fair bit of work to reintroduce consumers in the US, particularly to Shiraz. But the interesting thing there is that, and this is not just out of this research, but other research that we have conducted in the past. Luckily enough, the problem does not seem to be that US consumers do not like Shiraz. It's a matter of trying to make sure that Shiraz goes back in being a top of mind wine, a great variety of choice for that group of consumers. And we also seen that there are some interesting opportunities at around $19.99 US and above. We also believe that we need a major push, like, for example, through the $50 million grant for the growth of Australian wines in the US. And we really need to make sure that we are able to make two things work hand in hand. On the one side, make sure that we're able to make people think about Australian wines when they think wine. And this is what we will call the mental availability side of the story. but we also need to make sure that the wines are physically available for people to buy them. Because if we build the image and the wines are not there, we're only doing half of the job. Or if we are exporting wine there, but people are not thinking about Australia when they're choosing wine, again, we would have done only half of the job. We put all of this now together in a tool that we hope can be useful for all of you listening to this webinar, and that we are going to release, I think, fairly soon. We're going to discuss particularly this at a next Wine Technical Conference workshop that I will mention to you in a few seconds. And so all that information, all the results of the project are now in this tool called the US Wine Marketing Tool. This tool works in two ways. On the one side, you can start by answering some questions about your target market. You can see here under what we call the page 1, answering questions about the target market that you want to reach, and the tool gives you in return the product features that you should push more and promote in order to be more effective with this target market. Or you can do the other way around. If you turn to page 2, you can start by saying, what are the features that I want to promote in the US market? And the tool will give you in return the segment of consumers and trade that will be most responsive to the features that you want to promote. So as I said, I only had 20 minutes at my disposal, so I'm sorry I couldn't go more in details with these results. But if you're interested more about this, we are running a workshop at the next Wine Tech Wine Tech conference on Sunday, the 21st of July, 4:37 p.m. We're going to go more in detail about this project with myself and my colleague Larry Lockshin from UniSI. My colleague as well, Roberta Crouch from Flinders University, will cover in detail another project that we have run in the US market called the Ties That Bind project that, if I remember correctly, Roberta presented through another webinar just a few months ago. Peter Bailey from Wine Australia will give an overview, sort of the insights and latest trends that we see in the US wine market. And then we're going to have a panel session with Brian Lamb, Daniel McKeever, Peter Grenoff, and Scott Kaslaki, who are going to talk about challenges and opportunities in the US market. So don't miss out. Go on the registration link, and I look forward to see you there. Thank you very much for listening. And as I'm switching to Amelia, I'm happy to get any questions that you might have.
Yeah, there is a question here, Armando. The question is, do you see wine tech advancements in the authentication space and verification of provenance playing a part in building confidence in these markets at all?
Well, yes, I think we need to make sure that the story is definitely authentic, because with the product needs to be a good product. So in a sense, technical advancement is critical, I think, for the growth of Australian wines there in the US. But really, I think it's probably more than that. It's really about trying to communicate a clear message, making sure that we go there with I would say yes, with a clear strategy of what is the image that we want to build.
Excellent, thank you. There's no other questions come
Beautiful.
through, so thank you for that. And we'll now pass you over to Amelia.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to take a few minutes to update you all on all things Aussie Wine Month, otherwise known as the Far From Ordinary campaign. You may or may not be familiar with this, but first I want to give you some background on our activities in the USA, which is supported by the Australian government's 50 million export and regional wine support package. Because really Aussie Wine Month is bringing together a 3-year strategic plan, and it's integrated into one single campaign. Okay. As Kirstin and Armando indicated, in recent years, Australian wine sales have taken a hit. The Australian wine category had an enormous amount of exposure to global trade dynamics, and nowhere did it show more than the US market. Aussie Wine Month, or Far From Ordinary as it's known, is about repositioning the category We've been encouraging premiumisation. We've been continuing to invest in visits and all of our other activities to sell a positive story about Australian wine and say, yes, we fell down, but we're back, and we're back with a much healthier complexion for long-term success. Year one of the strategic engagement strategy, we really focused on the gatekeepers. We tried to get the smallest number of names with the greatest amount of influence and said, how can we really target these people? And if we get their attention, what do we want to say? We got a list of 150 to 200 Tier A influencers, such as owners of key media publications, chain retailers, chain restaurants, really planting the seeds to better promote the category. Then in year two, we wanted to expand it from there. We dabbled a little bit with consumers. Under the Australian Wine Made Our Way brand umbrella, we more or less were able to unite everyone, and it changed the way the US trade saw us and help us open up our engagement network. We also held Australia Decanted for the first time last year, which was a big change. We had 100 people at Lake Tahoe, unprecedented social coverage, and demand for us to do it again, which is great. Which brings me to the third year. We opened up to the mass consumer while still talking to trade, but we ramped up our media partnerships with Bon Appetit, Condé Nast, Vanity Fair, and finally, we're integrating all of this into one single consumer and trade strategic engagement campaign known as Far From Ordinary. So what is Far From Ordinary? It's Wine Australia's biggest ever integrated marketing campaign. It's many, many years in the making. It's breaking down what we understand is the most complicated market in the world into its really important components and saying, if we work in a concerted fashion in these different areas, we can really try and create some change for the Australian category going forward. For those not familiar with the Far From Ordinary campaign, RGA is our global creative strategy partner, and Far From Ordinary is a campaign they've hatched which sets out the Aussie Wine Month strategy. It's all about natural beauty, images of oceans and soil underfoot, and positioning Australia as on the other side of the world, but even further away in the consumer perception mind. It's bringing beautiful imagery and dynamic positioning of Australia to life with screens, animations, and even dirt on the ground. The main elements of the campaign are a 6-city roadshow covering New York City, Chicago, Miami, Dallas, LA, San Francisco. Consumer activations in New York City. We have 3 similar repeatable events on a Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday evening in New York, and we're expecting 400 consumers per night. We have a new to market showcase, which is essentially a tasting and networking event in New York City for those who are seeking US importers. We have Australian Women in Wine Awards on Tuesday the 17th of September, and we've had a great response with expressions of interest so far. I think we're in the 60s in terms of women who have signed up to participate, and this is very much a PR opportunity. Retail and restaurant promotions. We're creating commercial relevance for retailers and restaurant chains when they're looking to do programs. We're encouraging them to consider regional messaging and giving guidance about what products to put on the floor. And then there's wholesaler engagement, which is finding different ways to engage with importers and distributors if they're keen to revisit their Australian wine portfolio. It's about asking them how we can help them do that. So the Roadshow itself is the key trade event within the Far From Ordinary campaign. There are more than 100 Australian wine exhibitors that have signed up to participate, visiting 6 of the most influential cities in the USA. An unprecedented platform for wine businesses to showcase Australia's fine wine. And it's all about educating and exciting trade and consumers about Australian wine through grand tastings, masterclasses, and Australian Wine Discovered, our education platform, speakeasy lounges to really create conversations around what's the exciting things that are happening in the Australian wine space. Just a high-level overview of Australia Decanted. This is the second round of this event. And this falls at the very end of the Far From Ordinary Aussie Wine Month campaign. So this is a 4-day wine immersion and activation program at Lake Tahoe. Essentially, it's inviting top-tier trade and media to experience Australian wine on their home soil. So it's sort of overcoming that distance factor. We have 16 winemakers from regions across Australia, fantastic winemaker talent, including the likes of Stephanie Dutton, Vanya Cullen, Nick Ryan, Mike Benny, Karina Wright, Tim Kirk from Clonakilla. The list goes on. And again, opportunity to engage, educate and excite top-tier USA wine trade and media. So 100 are invited again, and they're completely new to the invite list from last year. And it'll be a series of seminars, tastings and breakout sessions over the 4 days. So that's a really exciting opportunity, and that's the 6th to the 10th of October. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Yes, I have a question for you. Where can people go to find out about all of the activities that are on, and how do they get involved?
So expressions of interest for Aussie Wine Month or Far From Ordinary campaign were open some time ago. We've, as I said, had a great response. I believe we're now at a wait list, so registrations have closed. However, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to get in touch via Linda, and we can follow up their direct query. But all the information is on the website, on Wine Australia's website, under Aussie Wine Month and Aussie Roadshow.
Brilliant, awesome. Thank you very much. There's no other questions coming through, but if they pop through in the next few seconds, because sometimes typing takes a little while, I'll let you know. I would like to just, I forgot to mention before that this webinar is being recorded and will be housed on the WCA website in the next few days. Plus, you will also be sent out for anyone who's registered, you'll be sent out a link to review the presentation at your convenience at any time. There's some fantastic information in there, so I'm sure that you'd love to have a look at it again. I'd like to thank our panel members today. Thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to have such great calibre of people in the room. They, like me, don't like seeing their face on webinars, but I think it's good for you to see us and see what we're doing. USA market is clearly a target for the Australian wine industry, and with all the data that you've presented today, understandably. Our next webinars are actually on the WCA website. We have one that was confirmed today that will be an extra special webinar from the Australian Grape and Wine Association on the 1st of July, where we will be talking about the $10 million cellar door grant. So if anyone's interested in that, please, by all means, get involved in that by registering. It'll be on our website probably by tomorrow. On the 11th of June is our normal scheduled webinar, which is with our lovely friends at Finlayson's, who will be talking to us about the important topic of wine tax. Sounds dry, but they seem to do it well. Anyway, thanks for joining us today. There has been a comment from a lovely person online saying, well done, panel members, thank you very much. So everyone else is thanking you. And we will see you next month. Thanks, everybody. Bye.